In August 2025, something shifted along the eastern front of Ukraine that military analysts would spend months trying to fully understand. It did not begin with a roar of artillery or the thunder of armored columns. It began quietly, almost surgically, with small Russian groups slipping through gaps in Ukrainian defensive lines near the mining city of Dobropilya in Donetsk Oblast, approximately 23 kilometers north of the strategically vital city of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian open-source intelligence group Deep State described the situation as quite chaotic, warning that the enemy was infiltrating deep, trying to quickly entrench and amass forces for further advances. It was not a classical breakthrough, it was something more insidious and in many ways more dangerous. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Pokrovsk represents. It is a key transportation and logistics hub linking Donetsk and Kramatorsk to Ukraine's central Dnipropetrovsk region, a city that once supplied 90% of the country's steelmaking needs through its coking coal mine, a city that has seen its population collapse from 60,000 before the war to fewer than 7,000 civilians who remained as the shells fell closer and closer. Losing Pokrovsk would not just be a territorial concession, it would be a structural rupture in Ukraine's defensive spine across the entire eastern theater. Moscow understood this, and in the late summer of 2025, it committed resources on a scale that had not been seen since the assault on Bakhmut. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed that Russia had concentrated approximately 150,000 troops in the Pokrovsk area, out of a total of 700,000 Russian personnel then present across Ukrainian territory. Powerful mechanized units and 4 Marine brigades were drawn into the offensive. This was not a probe. This was a strategic commitment and a declaration that Moscow intended to collapse Ukraine's eastern defenses and present the world with facts on the ground. But the ambition of the plan would collide violently and repeatedly with the realities of modern warfare on the Ukrainian battlefield. The August infiltration near Dobropilya initially looked like a coup. Several villages were overrun by Russian forces in what military observers described as a dramatic infiltration of Ukrainian lines, with the breach threatening to compromise the defense of the entire region if allowed to develop. Ukraine's response was swift and revealing about the stakes involved. Kyiv redeployed some of its most hardened fighting units, the 1st Azov Corps Command, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, assault troops, and paratroopers to contain the rupture. These were not second-line garrison forces. These were Ukraine's elite, pulled from other demanding sectors of the 2,500-kilometer front to plug a hole that Moscow hoped would become a highway. What followed was not the rapid encirclement that Russian planners had envisioned. The 150,000-strong grouping, so an enormous concentration of combat power by any measure, found itself caught in a trap that was partly geographic, partly technological, and partly the product of Russia's own strategic miscalculations. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War noted that rivers, the absence of bridges, anti-tank ditches, and lowlands in the area constrained Russia's ability to maneuver, while Ukraine retained the ability to strike deep into the Russian salient from positions north of Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. The terrain that Russian commanders had hoped would funnel their forces forward instead became a series of kill zones, each one surveilled continuously by Ukrainian drone operators who could track every movement, every supply convoy, every attempted repositioning. This is where the 150,000 began to pay the price of their own momentum. Drone warfare had, by 2025, fundamentally restructured the logic of land combat. Ukrainian troops on the front reported that Russian forces in the Pokrovsk direction were suffering from severe logistical degradation. Frostbite casualties were mounting, logistics had collapsed to minimal levels, soldiers were sitting in dugouts for weeks, and there were frequent amputations, often without evacuation. One Ukrainian serviceman monitoring intercepted communications wrote that the Russians complained most bitterly about losses, that out of 40 men in a single group, only 7 remained alive. These were not the communications of a conquering army. They were the communications of men who had been fed into a grinder and were beginning to understand what that meant. Russia's total casualties for 2025 alone reached approximately 415,000 killed and wounded, the second deadliest year of the entire conflict for Moscow's forces. This followed 2024, which had been even more catastrophic, with approximately 430,000 Russian casualties in that single year alone. In other words, across just 2 years of fighting, Russia had lost nearly 900,000 troops, a force almost 5 times the size of its total initial invasion force in February 2022. The 150,000 concentrated around Pokrovsk were not an invincible spearhead. They were increasingly a trapped mass, unable to advance meaningfully, unable to withdraw without catastrophic political consequences for the Kremlin, and hemorrhaging men at a rate that no recruitment drive could sustainably replace. The strategy Moscow was employing had a name among military analysts: attritional mass. From late February 2024 to early January 2026, Russian forces advanced just under 50 kilometers in the Pokrovsk direction at an average pace of only about 70 meters per day, slower than almost any major offensive campaign in any modern war. To put that in perspective, 70 meters is roughly the length of 2 freight train cars. For each of those meters, Russia was paying in blood at a rate that would, by early 2026, begin to exceed its capacity to replenish. In February 2026, Western officials assessed for the first time since the invasion's beginning that Russia was losing more soldiers than it was able to recruit, with losses reaching 40,000 per month since November 2025. And yet the Kremlin pressed on. By October 2025, Russian forces had managed to infiltrate Pokrovsk itself. Ukrainian military sources confirmed that approximately 200 Russian troops had accumulated within the city, penetrating in fire teams of 2 to 3 personnel and sheltering in basements and buildings, waiting for reinforcements that logistics made increasingly difficult to deliver. It was a haunting inversion of what Russian commanders had planned. Rather than a coordinated combined arms breakthrough that swept across the region, what Moscow achieved was the insertion of small, isolated groups into a city that Ukrainian forces continued to contest block by block. Gerasimov claimed to Putin that Russian forces had surrounded thousands of Ukrainian troops near Pokrovsk. The Institute for the Study of War assessed these claims as very likely false, noting that the Kremlin was exploiting Russia's reliance on infiltration missions and the absence of contiguous front lines to manufacture exaggerated battlefield claims for both domestic and international audiences. The information war surrounding Pokrovsk became almost as consequential as the physical one. At his year-end press conference, Putin claimed Russian forces had captured Pokrovsk, as well as Lyman, Siversk, Vovchansk, and Kostiantynivka, sweeping assertions that Western analysts and satellite imagery largely contradicted. ISW found evidence that Russian forces occupied only a fraction of these cities, in some cases less than 7% of a settlement's area. The gap between what Moscow was telling its domestic audience and what was visible from space was staggering. But the Kremlin's information strategy was not primarily aimed at military truth. It was aimed at shaping Western political will, projecting an image of inevitability to pressure European leaders and Washington into pushing Kiev toward concessions. Then came the reversal. In early 2026, something extraordinary happened. Ukraine made its largest battlefield gains in over 2.5 years, not counting the Kursk offensive, retaking over 200 square kilometers between February 11 and 15, 2026 alone. The advance coincided with a critical disruption to Russian communications infrastructure. The Russian military was blocked from using Starlink, causing communication failures compounded by the Russian government's own decision to cut access to Telegram, the primary platform through which Russian frontline units coordinated, shared intelligence, and even called for reinforcements. The 150,000 concentrated around Pokrovsk suddenly found themselves not just logistically strained, but communicatively blinded. Units that had relied on consumer technology to compensate for broken military communication chains were, in the span of days, operating in the dark. Most of the territory taken in the August 2025 Dobropilia breach had, by that point, already been cleared by Ukrainian forces, with the exception of a handful of Russian holdouts who were effectively encircled, cut off from supply, cut off from command, and unable to exfiltrate through a front that Ukraine's drone operators watched in near real time. The breach that had once threatened to unravel Ukraine's eastern defense had become a trap. The hunters had become the hunted. Russian mill bloggers, the military correspondents who serve as an informal conscience of the Russian armed forces, had been raising alarms for months, questioning why Russian commanders were still feeding men into mechanized assaults that Ukrainian drones were destroying in real time, and asking which elements of the Russian military chain were feeding false reports up the command structure to generals who reported to a political leadership that was incapable of hearing bad news. These were not the voices of dissidents. These were pro-war nationalists, men who wanted Russia to win, watching their country's military be consumed by its own strategic rigidity. By early 2026, CSIS analysts estimated that since February 2022, Russia had suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, more losses than any major power in any war since World War II. And what had those 1.2 million casualties purchased? Russia had captured approximately 29,000 square miles of additional Ukrainian territory since the full-scale invasion began, an area roughly equivalent to half the size of the state of Illinois, at an average monthly gain rate across 2025 of just 171 square miles. At that pace, Russia would require decades to achieve the territorial ambitions Putin had outlined. The math, by any strategic calculus, was catastrophic. The 150,000 Russians who had been concentrated around Pokrovsk had not simply failed to encircle a Ukrainian city. They had demonstrated in vivid and irreversible detail the limits of mass without maneuver, of ambition without logistics, of a military doctrine that had not reckoned with the drone, the satellite, and the speed of modern open-source intelligence. The breach that began 23 kilometers from Pokrovsk in the summer of 2025 had indeed changed the map, but not in the direction Moscow intended. It had revealed to anyone willing to look the structural exhaustion of a force that had been spending lives like currency in a war it could not afford to lose and could not find a way to win. What started as a breach became a siege. What became a siege is becoming a monument to the cost of miscalculation and to the stubborn resilience of a country that refused to be overrun.